Storming a wall meant being pulped by stones and arrows burned by pitch hacked in the breach. Nevertheless, Crusaders vied for the vanguard, after priests blessed their blades as penance, as your penance strike. If you die, you will be holy martyrs. You will have seats in paradise. Because contrary to popular belief, many sought salvation in battle. In this video we ask why Crusaders were willing to face arrows, fire, and sword to earn paradise. He was called the Leper King, but in the spring of 1179, Baldwin IV rode like any young monarch, chasing an idea, a stone keep at Jacob's Ford that would bar Saladin's road and give his vassals breathing space. The work was not noble proclamations, but mud and rope. Peasants prying rock, Templars hauling timber, engineers sweating over a sapping trench, and every mason who sank a post was a son or a brother that the king could not easily replace. Word came from Cairo. Saladin would pay handsomely to see the fortress razed. 60,000 dinars, then 100,000, a fortune that could feed the kingdom for years and buy peace for the people who had already bled for Baldwin's rule. The choice sat on the king's chest like his disease money, and survival for many, or the stubborn defense of honor and frontier that had built his reputation. A council gathered where candles threw long shadows against war maps and the king's gaunt face. A monk leaned toward Baldwin, and with the blunt certainty of hymn and heroic epic recited to the knights what their culture had taught them: if you die, you will be holy martyrs. You will have seats in paradise the great. The words hung like an anvil for the knights. They were not metaphor but currency. Salvation could be earned with a lance and a good death. Opposite, a steward counted mouths and grain and whispered of children and widows who would starve if raids resumed. The steward's plea was conscience. The monk's was honor, and promised eternity. Outside, the castle took shape in the noise that archaeology still remembers. Iron striking oak fragments of arrowheads found later in the silt, the footprints of peasants who would wake to the cry of siege. A veteran who had ridden with the First Crusade sat near the hearth and told a story in holiest tones, insisting that armies had once appeared in white on a hill to save God's men. There came out of the mountains also countless armies with white horses whose standards were all white. To many present, this was eyewitness theology. The decision arrived in the form of a single afternoon. Saladin's envoy waited with a sealed purse. The steward begged to accept. The monk demanded refusal. Baldwin felt his legs fail and his mind sharpen. He could swallow the coin and tear up the plans, spare the laborers, spare the townsfolk, or he could refuse and bind his name to a castle that would either hold and redeem, or provoke a war that might burn wives and fathers to ash. This would be like a modern soldier being told that volunteering for a highly publicized symbolic assault will win medals, fame, and institutional praise, or die and leave his family destitute. The social pressure to be heroic would crush any private wish to go home. Baldwin chose honor. He refused the bribe, signed the work to continue, and mounted toward responsibility. The consequence was merciless, and all too medieval. Saladin struck. Jacob's Ford was razed. Many were slaughtered or sold. The keep became a smoldering lesson in limits. Baldwin's reputation as resolute held. He had acted like a king and a knight, but his conscience carried the corpses. The medieval moral economy had required men to translate earthly glory into eternal accounts. In that ledger, the only acceptable currency was sacrifice. Knowing the promise of paradise and the praise of your peers, you suddenly see how a man like Baldwin could refuse a purse and send people to their deaths, and you feel with a chill that in his moral calculus you might well have done the same. Fulcher of Chartres stood among the press at Clermont on 27 November at 1095 and later wrote what he had seen, as if still smelling the dust and hearing the shout. Urban Day climbed a platform and spoke not as a remote bishop but as a commander, describing a wound, the loss of the holy places, the suffering of Eastern Christians, the desecration of tombs. At the end of his charge, the assembly rose as one, and the air answered, Deus vult, God wills it, a cry Fulcher records like a verdict rather than a cheer. The sound itself became a sacrament, turning the crowd into a single body ready to act. Urban did not merely urge, he put a promise on the table that would change lives. He framed the expedition as more than pilgrimage or plunder. The man who took up the sign of the cross would be released from his sins, absolved as if by pilgrimage itself. Fulcher later paraphrases the offer as a remission so total it rewired hope men were told they would gain. Complete remission of all their sins, if they fought for the holy places. For knights who live by honor and peasants who measured worth in service, the word was an earthquake. Sudden forgiveness, a divine ledger wiped. Around Fulcher, the reactions split into faces he would sketch in ink and memory: bishops, who counted ecclesiastical duty, and papal momentum; urban burghers who imagined safety from marauders; and young knights who smelled glory. One of those knights, a lean youth named Geoffrey, who had been Fulcher's parishioner, knelt before the bishop and looked up with the cross already pressed to his lips in his eyes. Fulcher read more than zeal, a seed of fear for the wife and unborn child he would leave behind. The crowd interpreted Geoffrey's vow as triumph. Fulcher felt it as an exile, a household pulled apart in the name of salvation. Then came the instant that would haunt Fulcher's pen. Urban signaled the clergy to lay hands and bless the taking of the cross, and every priest there, Fulcher included, was called to lend the church's voice to a war. To refuse would be to stand against the Pope, to be branded a coward or heretic, to forfeit reputation and place. To comply was to give the church's seal to killing, and send Geoffrey away with the promise that his death would be righteous. Fulcher's conscience, trained on gospel charity, recoiled at the moral arithmetic. His honor as a cleric and his survival in the ecclesiastical order demanded assent. He raised his hand and blessed. Knights rode off to chance, families wept, and the cathedral's authority rode with them as armor. The immediate consequence was unmistakable. Those who went carried papal absolution as both shield and incentive. Those who remained learned that moral legitimacy had become transferable currency. This was a psychological trap. When salvation can be bought by sacrifice in battle, honor, reputation, and conscience collapse into one irrevocable choice. This would be like a modern equivalent where a trusted leader offers legal immunity and moral valor to volunteers for a deadly covert operation. Community pressure, the promise of absolution, and fear for family push men into impossible acts. In that system, Fulcher admits between the lines, "Oh God, I would have done the same thing." Baldwin IV, the leper king, stands at the center of a political theology sewn into law. Vows, papal letters, and municipal charters turned warfare into a ledger of salvation. Popes, church councils, and local authorities had created a machinery where taking the cross, swearing a vow in a charter, and receiving clerical blessing carried promises, absolution, and fear for family pushmen into impossible acts. In that system, Fulcher admits between the lines, "Oh God, I would have done the same thing." Baldwin IV, the leper king, stands at the center of a political theology sewn into law. Vows, papal letters, and municipal charters turned warfare into a ledger of salvation. Popes, church councils, and local authorities. In November 1177, after the crushing charge at Montchessard, the camp buzzes with exultation and religious language. A priest reads the chronicle aloud as men divvy the plunder. A veteran officer, quoting the chronicler with a triumphant smile, shouts, "They came according to the words of the prophet, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil." The line is less history than liturgy, a text turned into justification for the pursuit of fugitives and the taking of captives. For Baldwin, a claim and the visible signs of God's favor are political capital. Every trophy bolsters his fragile kingship and persuades doubters that his leprosy is not a curse but a divine test. At the Templar tent, the Grand Master answers questions of ransom and mercy with a single hard line: "A Templar's only ransom is his dagger." Spoken like a creed, it crystallizes the order's honor code: no shame, no bargaining, only fight. That motto is not merely military pride, it channels the penitential economy. Dying in battle, refusing ransom, earning martyrdom and immediate salvation. For men whose identity, oath, and reputation are public sacraments, the choice to show mercy looks dangerously like sacrilege, an undermining of the vow, and a risk to the social order that has sacralized violence. Then comes the real-time decision. A column of prisoners, combatants, servants, even children, appears at the edge of the plain, exhausted and pleading. The captains demand slaughter and sail. Clergy whisper of required penance and the need to keep fear in the enemy. The king's sister begs for mercy on behalf of captured townsfolk. Baldwin must choose publicly, authorize mercy, and risk being called weak, accused of breaking the sacramental logic that justifies the crusade, or order the killing and secure reputation. ransom and immediate safety for his people. The camp waits on the king's word. History watches a moral arithmetic play out. Baldwin chooses as his age expects. He allows pursuit and the selling of captives. Short-term survival and honor preserved, long-term vengeance ensured. The immediate reward is clear: flourishing reputation, pay for his troops, a message sent to Saladin. But the consequence is psycholized there is bay. But the consequence is psycholized jiga there anstatio offers. Ball of Wayar. Institutions. And shortwere. Institutions. And shortwere. Institutions. Short-term survival and honor preserved, long-term vengeance ensured. The immediate salvation. For his people the camp waits on the king's word. History watches a moral arithmetic play out. Baldwin keeps his crown. He was Odo of Saint Armand, a man whose helmet cast a longer shadow than most lords, Grand Master of the Templars, in an age when war and prayer braided into the same vow. At Montcassard and again at Marjayoun, his men rode like sacrament, and the chroniclers remembered how their charge felt preordained. The papal and popular language of the day made battle a means to salvation. On the eve of a fight, a chaplain shouted the comfort every knight wanted to hear: "The Christians, strengthened by the grace shed upon them from on high." And the men rode for glory, believing God himself kept their flanks. For Odo, these weren't slogans, they were the rules that justified everything he had given: his life, his name, his order. When Saladin's forces counterstruck, and the tide turned, Odo's world narrowed to a single terrible moment. His banner struck his knights, scattered himself, dragged from the field, dying of wounds and pride. The Templar rule forbade earthly family but not brotherhood. His brothers in white depended on the order's fearless reputation to hold castles, collect revenues, and recruit young men who believed martyrdom beat coin. The material stakes were real too. Ransom could buy relief for dozens, keep forts garrisoned, shield peasant families who relied on Templar protection. Honor, reputation, salvation. All of it braided into one decision that would be read for generations. In the dark courtyard of a Syrian prison, Saladin's envoys laid out a bargain that would have solved immediate human needs: sacks of gold for Odo's life letters promising safe return for captives, the loosening of a siege if Odo yielded counsel. To accept would spare brothers, perhaps save unarmed villagers and keep towers from falling. To refuse would be to accept slow death, and to cement the Templar rule against ransom. It is here that medieval logic tightened like a noose. Reputation and perceived holiness were not abstract. They were the currency that kept communities safe and war possible. Odo answered as the order had taught him: a Templar's only ransom is his dagger. The words were reported as defiance, as sanctity. He chose reputation over rescue. The consequence was immediate and paradoxical. His refusal made him a martyr, hero in Christendom. A tale that recruited fresh volunteers and hardened the order's myth. At the same time, his captives endured, some dying in chains, who might have been freed by the price on the table. The men who survived to tell the story hailed the purity of the vow. The widows whose bread depended on those ransoms did not. Odo's dignity preserved an institution's honor and burned the people who could not live on stories. This would be like a modern special forces commander who is offered a plea that would free his unit, but only if he reveals operations that would ruin his reputation and betray his oath, pressured to choose between the lives under his command and the integrity that keeps others trusting him. In that logic, where honor is survival and survival is honor, it's chillingly easy to see how otherwise decent men step into a moral trap, act to save the living and lose what keeps whole communities together, or sacrifice those lives to preserve a system everyone depends on. Put in the same bindings, and honestly, I can see myself doing the same thing. He came from a household that taught two things with equal fervor: how to carry a spear and how to confess sins. A priest in his village had preached that martial labor could be as holy as monastic toil, and on the road a minstrel had sung of saints who rode into battle and found absolution there. The logic was simple and irresistible. Violence could be penance. In camp, the chaplain leaned close and told the men, "If you die, you will be holy martyrs. You will have seats in Paradise the Great." And that promise slipped like armor into a young man's bones. He answered vows as much to secure his heir's future as to be saved fighting promised lands for his kin, a name for his lineage, and a heavenly ledger scrubbed clean. When the town fell, he saw what the theology of penance made ordinary captive families huddled in dust, townsfolk weeping and nights smelling like victory and smoke. Orders came to parade the prisoners before the garrison for judgment. Some argued ransom, others immediate slaughter to terrify neighboring strongholds. Around the hearth, the same songs that had sent him east were sung now as celebration, but his hands trembled when a child touched his boot. He knew the medieval calculus. To strike bravely was to earn spiritual credit, to spare would brand him soft and risk his household standing. On the march, his captain stopped, raised his sword, and the company replied with the old cry, Dios vult, a shout that folded piety and purpose into one motion. The captain's face was hard. He wanted an example made that would send a lesson as far as any castle wall. Make no weakness here, another knight barked, our honor must be plain. The chaplain muttered that striking was itself a penance, an order sanctified by God and song, and the men readied their lances as if swallowing absolution. At the line of captives, the moment became sharp and hot like steel. A boy, barefoot pleading, looked up and said nothing because he had nothing left to bargain with. The young knight held his spear where the sun would catch it, and saw his image in the blade, a protector of kin, a penitent to God, a future husband and father who could not return untested. The captain's eyes met his, and there was no mercy in them. Around him, the chorus of approval and the promise of reputational safety pressed like a hand on his chest. He could lower the spear, free them, and face whispers that would gnaw his prospects, or he could obey, keep his name, his dowry, prospects for his sister, the material security for his line, and call it salvation. He struck. The immediate consequence was a shower of approval, a raised standard, a chant that made the lads feel like saints and murderers. At once his sister's dowry would be safe, his house would be honored, and the chaplain blessed the deed. That night alone he tasted the gap between theological comfort and conscience. The logic that had made killing a path to paradise also closed the path out of that violence afterward. This would be like a modern soldier ordered to execute prisoners to avoid being labeled weak by his unit, and thereby losing promotion and pension, where career, peer judgment, and institutional promises conspire to punish mercy. In that system, the choice felt inevitable, and looking back he understood with a cold clarity that makes your stomach drop. Oh God, in that system I would have done the same thing. Tancred of Hauteville stands on the Mount of Olives and looks down at Jerusalem like a man who's glimpsed his own death and rewards at once. He presses his palm to his chest, and as the chronicler would later put into words, whispers to a companion he would willingly have given his life there, and then just for the chance to press his lips to that most holy church. His family back in Apulia expects him to win land and honor as a younger son. His soul, he is told, also hangs in the balance. Everything he is, lineage, reputation, the possibility of a fief, has become folded into a single act. Sees the city win God's favor or fail and be forgotten. On the eve of the assault, the preaching grows louder, a monk climbing a cart to shout theology as if it were war gear. He points at the armored men and hammers on the logic that has taught generations to trade life for salvation. If you die, you will be holy martyrs. You will have seats in paradise the great. The words land like a promise, and a demand to refuse is not merely. At the city gate, Tancred faces the moment history will remember and his conscience will not forget. A group of non-combatants, women carrying infants, old men with trembling hands, emerge pleading for mercy. Behind them, his captain signals slaughter or we fail the vow. Spare them, and he risks being branded weak, losing the support he needs to make a lordship back home. Kill them, and he secures his standing, his place in the retinue, and perhaps that promised salvation. Time seems to compress the priest's trumpet, the clank of mail, the smell of smoke. Every cultural pressure is a hand forcing his blade to fall. The choice is not clean conscience versus brutality, but honor versus human pity, each presented as a path to survival, social or spiritual. He moves with the host. Mercy is outvoted by the machinery of crusading honor, and he raises his sword. The immediate consequence is the applause of comrades and the binding of his name to victory. The private consequence is a night that will not let him sleep, a conscience that will keep asking whether the promise of paradise was ever meant for men who must choose between butcher and savior. This would be like a modern equivalent where a soldier is told a ruthless strike will win medals and promotion, where refusing means career death and communal exile. In that moral economy, slaughter looks less like sin than currency, and the trap of medieval values is psychological, when salvation, status, family, fortune, and survival are yoked to the same act. Even a decent man can feel he has no choice. Oh God, in that system I would have done the same thing.